if we've got this existing context, let's exploit it. Let's say we acknowledge this whole thing, that it was slightly a British Spider-Man, and play that up.
Forget Sideways, forget those shit mobile games. I will tell you about a Spider-Man ripoff that you have probably never heard of, but is probably the best Spider-Man ripoff of all time. Now, I say ripoff. I don't really like using that word. I prefer to use the term cribbed. Now, cribbing is a long-held tradition in British comics. In British vernacular, cribbing means to steal. More appropriately in this context, it means to copy. But the real art of the crib isn't just to James Somerton somebody else's work. No, the real essence of the crib is to change it just enough so that it feels like its own thing. Like I do when I steal Hot Cider's thumbnails. Back in the 1970s, comic book writers and artists would crib all of their good ideas from film and TV. And they would do this a lot. Now, whilst most British boys' comic books were about astronauts or race car drivers or soldiers or spies, there weren't really that many cape books going around. So when American superhero comics started appearing on the newsstands, they too became ripe for the cribbing. The Leopard from Lime Street first appeared in the March 1976 issue of Buster magazine. Buster was a traditional British anthology comic. It was very different from the kind of thing you'd get from Marvel or DC. Each issue would tell stories about different characters, with each story inside the comic taking up 1 or 2 pages. Buster had the kind of humour stories that you'd often see in comics like the Beano or the Dandy. Stories about kids getting into scrapes, defying authority, mucking about in school, all that kind of stuff. But what it also had was its fair share of science fiction and action stories. The Leopard from Lime Street wasn't the only strip in Buster going for this more grown-up, more dynamic style. The strip's writer, Tom Tully, was a legend of British comic books. Writing classic action comics like Kelly's Eye and The Steel Claw in the 1960s, he wrote Roy of the Rovers in a near enough unbroken run for over 30 years. I appreciate that not everybody's going to have heard of those comics, but they were a pretty big deal here. But even with all that pedigree, the Leopard from Lime Street knows exactly what it is. Tully knows that he's cribbing from the most popular American comic of all time in order to appeal to kids. The character's origin is covered in the very first issue, and tell me these guys aren't having a lot of fun. 13-year-old Billy Farmer lives with his elderly aunt and uncle in the town of Selbridge, somewhere in England. Selbridge is a made-up town, but it is this sort of vague amalgam of post-industrial British towns. Terraced houses, petty crime, fish and chips for tea, all that kind of stuff. Billy is your classic tragic teenager. He's got no parents, he's got no money, he's picked on at school for being a weedy little nerd, and then one day, on a school trip to the zoo, where Billy is taking pictures for the school paper, he is scratched by a radioactive leopard. Yep. And that night, at home, he gains the powers of a leopard. Rawr! We're talking the strength of a leopard, the speed, the agility, and the reflexes of, well, a cat. He's also got a great sense of smell. He can see in the dark. He's got all the radioactive leopard senses. Oh, but speaking of leopard senses, Billy also develops a super special leopard sense which can alert him to incoming danger. Rawr! Billy decides, because why wouldn't he, that he is going to fight crime as a costumed superhero on the streets of Selbridge. So, pulling out his old Puss in Boots costume that he wore at the school panto. I'm not sure if I need to explain panto to my American audience. Maybe you should go look that up. But anyway, here he is, the Leopard from Lime Street. Anyhow, catches thieves just like gazelles? What is it? What do leopards even eat? Fucking snakes? Within a few issues, Billy builds a utility belt that he can hold his camera on, and also his leopard-themed grappling hook so now he can thwip around the place. The first thing he does is catch a burglar. Then he makes a fool out of the school bully. Then he takes a picture of a crime in action and sells it to the editor of the local paper, Thaddeus Clegg. Of course, Clegg pays for the photographs, but he thinks that there's more to this Leopard Man than meets the eye. He thinks Leopard Man is a menace. Get me pictures of Leopard Man! It's classic, isn't it? Just talking about it makes me smile. I don't know how or why they came up with the idea of a leopard, but I love it. The first thing I noticed about this strip that really helps it stand out from other comics in Buster is these staggered, dynamic panels, really selling the action. This is impeccable work. Artists Mike Weston and Eric Bradbury are two of the most highly respected illustrators in the entire history of British comics. Lifelong collaborators, these boys drew a lot of comics between them, and they worked together on a lot of the same books. I think it's worth remembering that this was at a time when funny papers really were considered low art, but this did not stop these boys investing a tremendous amount of artistry into their work. They all knew that their work was destined to line the bottom of the budgie cage, but you can't say that these lads weren't giving it. The regular rhythm of the Leopard from Lime Street is Billy foiling burglars and robbers and general blue-collar criminals, while also balancing his life as a superhero with his life at home with his aunt and uncle, and also with his life at school. When the local youth club needs money for a new basketball net, Billy enters a wrestling tournament with a £250 top prize for anybody who could beat the masked hangman.
What are you doing up there?
Staying away from you.
That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you?
The first big difference between the Leopard and Spider-Man, except the setting, is Billy's home life. He has his frail old Aunt Joan, and he sells pictures to the paper to help her get by, but Billy's Uncle Charlie is still alive, and Uncle Charlie is a real hard case. This is not Uncle Ben. This isn't a rare character for the time. This isn't even a rare sight in comics of the time. But being rendered in this more realistic style, the way Uncle Charlie treats Billy hits a lot harder than, Dennis the Menace's dad giving him the slipper. The Leopard's first costume villain is Vampello the Human Bat. Turns out he's not superpowered, he's just a circus performer who moonlights as a robber. Worse yet, though, is he tries to frame the Leopard for his crimes by dressing in a leopard costume. Imposters are bizarrely frequent in The Leopard from Lime Street. The Snow Beast appears in one of the Christmas issues, and I was really hoping that I'd be able to say that this guy's basically like the Sandman but with snow instead of sand, but he's not. He's a robber who dresses up in a snowman costume. That's probably the biggest difference between Spider-Man and the Leopard. Spider-Man has all of these costumed supervillains. The Leopard's Rogues Gallery is kind of more like Scooby-Doo's Rogues Gallery. The Spider-Man Ripoff mask has kind of already started to slip, right? I mean, it was good clickbait to get you into the video, but once you start digging into the book, it doesn't really stand up for long. But what we're left with is this great British take on the Spider-Man myth. It's a very cute, dare I even say quaint take on the superhero book. I think what is genuinely incredible is how Tully and the artists scaled down Spider-Man from being this big urban story, the web slinger traversing New York City, battling superpowered villains, and then they scaled it down to this sleepy, bucolic British village. It's actually quite funny how cozy this feels when set against the big American comic that it's ripping off. In October of 1976, Buster was merged with another comic, Monster Fun. This sort of thing was quite common for kids' comics over here in the UK. Two books would come together and the publisher would basically have to choose which characters are we going to drop and which characters are we going to carry forward. And the good news is, the Leopard was so popular with readers that it continued on for another 8 years in Monster Fun. I read about 150 issues worth of Leopard from Lime Street in order to make this video. I read it in these 3 really big chunky trade paperbacks from Rebellion's Treasury of British Comics imprint. These books cover about the first 3 years of the Leopard from Lime Street, and that's all there is in print. I've read everything there is in print, but if they continue with these, then there's probably going to end up being like 8 or 9 volumes of this stuff. But, as I'm sure you can see in the timeline, the story of my favourite Spider-Man ripoff does not end there. Leopard Army never die! A grown-up, gritty reboot of the Leopard appeared in the Rebellion ensemble comic The Vigilant in the late 2010s. The Vigilant was Rebellion's attempt at doing a sort of Watchmen-style, gritty reimagining of all these old legacy comics properties, which Rebellion had been hoovering up for, the last 2 decades or so. But what is far more interesting to me, and far more exciting, is that the Leopard is back exactly where he belongs, in strip format, in a kid's comic. In 2021, Treasury of British Comics rebooted Monster Fun, and this has a bunch of old legacy British comic book characters, including the Leopard from Lime Street.
I loved writing The Vigilant. It was great fun, and I was very happy to do it. But that wasn't really the Leopard from Lime Street I wanted to write. So, when, I got a chance to do real, quote-unquote, Leopard from Lime Street, I was like, this is what I want to be doing. This is the character that deserves to come back in more or less the original form.
The Leopard has been appearing in Monster Fun since the very first relaunched issue in Halloween 2021. It's written by Simon Furman, and the art so far has been by Laurent Lefeuvre, Nick Roche, and PJ Holden. Simon Furman has had an illustrious career in independent and British comics, but for his sins, he is almost certainly most likely to be remembered for his work at Marvel UK, specifically on Transformers. He took something which was ostensibly very shallow, a comic book designed just to sell toys, and gave it a living, breathing universe. He created backstories for characters, motivations, and set about doing this wild universe building. Furman basically starts doing exactly what he did on Transformers all those years ago, and he starts setting up this big cosmic mythology which, truthfully, I think would have worked really well in like one of those Vertigo comics from the 90s. Billy Farmer is no longer just a kid who got scratched by a radioactive leopard. He's actually the latest in a long line of superpowered leopard people, stretching all the way back to prehistoric times. Getting scratched by that leopard was just the catalyst. That's what unlocked his hidden powers. I like the what he's doing here is, the way that Alan Moore did on Swamp Thing, or the way that Neil Gaiman did on Sandman, taking a really pulpy character who, has a very finite beginning and end, and actually saying, no, you know what? There's actually a massive cosmology here.
It felt like a sort of thing that hadn't really gone anywhere. In its whole 8-year run in Buster, it was pretty much, if you pick up the last episode of Leopard from Lime Street, you could have plopped it in at the beginning almost, and it would have read seamlessly. I just wanted to say, I'm not really interested in continuing that sort of half-life Leopard from Lime Street. I really want to give it some welly. I'd like to know about his powers. I'd like to know, is it as simple as he got scratched by a radioactive leopard? Could there be something more? And just all those elements, I thought, well, look, we may never get the chance again to do this. Let's layer in lots into quite a little space, really.
After re-establishing all the characters and the setting, Tall, Dark and Spooky here turns up saying that they want to suck out Billy's aura. And to everyone's surprise, they really are a spooky supernatural bad guy, not just a robber with a silly mask on. Not long after this, the Leopard finds out that this geezer belongs to a group of supernatural villains who call themselves the Cabal. It's probably not the same Cabal from QAnon. But then again, they do want to drink the life force of a minor, so... Anyway, it turns out that the cat people, the Felis, are a long-forgotten race who exist in secret in the modern age. They spend their lives in hiding from interdimensional beings like the characters that make up the Cabal, who cross over into our reality to feed on their life force. I really like how Furman is creeping into supernatural horror territory here, and I also like how he's pulling a lot of ideas and influences from British folklore. He uses a lot of animal totems, stuff like druids, skinwalkers, the Fae kingdom being this other reality that's right next to ours, and sufficiently powerful beings can cross over and eat the souls of the living or whatever. Sick.
It was in something called Monster Farm, so we thought we better have monsters and supernatural beings in it. There's a rich history in Britain of that sort of mythological being, and I think it just suited Leopard. It removed it slightly from the superhero, put it more into the realm of the Marvel Monsterverse, the Werewolf by Nights and the Morbiuses and the Man-Things. I think, that was kind of... I think I wanted that more than just plain superheroing.
This first arc introduces a lot of new enemies as the Cabal throw this revolving door of supernatural monsters at the Leopard and his new sidekick, Alleycat, so that they can try to capture them and milk out some of that sweet, sweet cat juice.
I told you, they milked you!
Along the way, Billy uncovers secrets about his parents, his family, and his lineage as the most recent incarnation of the Felis. I like that this book has 3 distinctly different artists, all essentially cutting loose and investing into their own personal styles. My personal favourite is Laurent Lefeuvre. I think she crushes it from page 1. Her pen work has this really spidery, delicate detail, and I love how all of her lines fall apart when she's showing action. Her colours have these really dreamy pastel vibes, and her foreshortening is, it is wicked. Roche is good, and it's really good to see more work from PJ Holden, but Lefebvre is my favourite illustrator on this so far. I think it's pretty clear they know what they're doing here. They've accepted the mantle of the Spider-Man ripoff, and Furman is going all in on the Spider-Man crib, to levels which Tully and his cohorts never really quite reached. I caught up with Simon Furman while making this video, and we had a really good chat about the Leopard. He was gleefully telling me about how much fun he was having leaning into the Leopard's legacy of being a Spider-Man ripoff. But also, he was keen to create a sense of newness, to carve out a place for the Leopard in British comics history.
The one Spider-Man trope they didn't use was to give him a kind of villains, rogues gallery. It was all very criminals, occasionally masked criminals, one disguised as a Yeti, I seem to remember. So there were... It always struck me as it was missing an element. They were missing a beat. I mean, it had a great cast of characters, but the villains were sadly lacking, I feel. But when I got the chance to do some new Leopard from Lime Street, I thought the first thing we're going to do is give him a roster of bad guys.
We've got a Mysterio clone as a recurring anti-hero with a shadowy past. We've got Kern the Huntsman, a Freak of the Week type character who is very clearly an analogue of Craven the Hunter, but also by way of Herne the Hunter, a figure from British folklore, and one of the very best Monster in My Pockets.
The guy with the skull crew is very much my version of Tombstone from Spider-Man. There's a scorpion type monster running around in the final part. I think there's even sort of goblin creatures in that end sequence. There's lots of references to Spider-Man villains.
Taking ownership of the original storyline, not changing or rebooting it, and then merging it with all this weird British folklore. It feels so congruent with books like Swamp Thing and Animal Man and Shade the Changing Man. I joked with Simon that like it feels like this is a lost British invasion comic that just kind of like got lost in a drawer for 30 years and someone's only just opened the drawer and found it. What I love is that we have the legacy of this pretty silly Spider-Man ripoff, but it's being handled respectfully by these new creators. I love the fact that Furman and his team have been given the creative freedom to come up with all these wild new ideas and to create something fresh, specifically for younger readers. I really liked that, and I really enjoyed reading this. The first year of The Leopard from Lime Street has just been released in trade paperback format by the Treasury of British Comics. It collects the first 11 strips into a single volume, but this is actually one of those few times where I would actually recommend tracking down all of the physical floppies. These comics were printed within the last couple of years. They're printed on thick, glossy paper. They're almost certainly going to be in pretty good nick, and there's a good chance you can just pick a bundle up on like Facebook Marketplace or in a charity shop or something. And then not only do you get, Leopard from Lime Street, but you also get Draculas and Kid Kong and Frankie Stein, Steel Commando, all these great legacy British characters rewritten and reintroduced for a young audience. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this pretty random dive into a obscure character from the annals of British comics. Big shout out to my existing channel contributors. I love the fact that these people will leave me a little tip at the end of each month. It means a lot. And if you wanted to support me on one of the higher tiers, you can earn yourself some pretty cool rewards, including stickers, prints, stuff like that. Anyway, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next upload. Ta-da!